In my quest to better understand McLaren Vale Grenache, I went to McLaren Vale at the end of June and I spoke to a number of producers about what they're doing here. This is a mini-series devoted to them and the answers that I got to the questions that I asked them. It's a 3-part series at this stage. We've got, in the first video, Toby Bekkers at Bekkers Winery, and I asked him about what it is, in his opinion, that makes McLaren Vale and Grenache go so well together. We also talk about his Grenache and a new exciting vineyard site that he has in Clarendon. The second video is a video with Giles Cook MW, who is the owner and winemaker at Thistledown Wines. I asked him about the terroir of McLaren Vale and whole bunch in the wines and what that does to them over the long term. And finally, in the third video, something slightly different, I've got Pete Fraser from Yangara and Steve Pannell from SC Pannell. And I get them on film together, and I'm actually standing behind the camera because I've only got 2 mics. And I ask them to talk to each other, and I round up all of the questions that I have, and it's centered around one big question, and that is, if they're making really fine-bodied, low-alcohol, light-framed Grenache, how are these wines going to age? And that's really at the centre of what I'm trying to understand in McLaren Vale, how they go in time. So I hope that you enjoy this mini-series. First up, Toby and I at Toby Bekkers Winery in McLaren Vale. So I'm here at Bekkers in the McLaren Vale with Toby Bekkers himself. And it's exciting for me because Toby and Emmanuel, his wife, split the business in half, right? You do the viticulture, she does the winemaking.
Yeah, that's our history. So Emma's French born and trained as a winemaker, and my background's the vineyard. Yeah. But in a business this size, you end up doing a
bit of everything both
together.
Of you. Yeah. And what I really wanted to do, Toby's been very kind to drive me around this morning and give me a real lay of the land, which I think if you're going into any wine region is really crucial to your understanding of why grapes taste the way they do and where the vineyards are situated and all of that cool, exciting stuff. But what I wanted to do was tap into Toby's knowledge here and talk about why Grenache and McLaren Vale work so very well together.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of those intangible things in wine that some varieties work better in some places than others, and sometimes it's very difficult to nail down that one reason because it's a multi-layered cake always. But for me, I think if you look at Grenache in McLaren Vale, a lot of regions do great Shiraz, and we're one of them, but there are very few places in the world where I think you can make such a unique expression of single variety Grenache as McLaren Vale. And my view on why that works is just this natural affinity between the plant and the place. So Grenache is a very difficult variety, and not in the sense that it's hard to get it to grow, it's in the sense that it's actually a very strong beast of a plant. So if you overstimulate that plant, of course you get massive commercial crops of pretty uninteresting fruit. So our job is to bonsai the thing really and try and control its natural natural vigour. Yeah. And so how do you create a bonsai? Well, you limit its access to the good things in life, I guess. So moisture, McLaren Vale, dry summer, you've got ultimate control over its access to moisture. And then the other way you make a bonsai is you put it in a small pot. And for us, that means we have these soils that we go looking for that are shallow, sandy, rocky, anything that's going to sort of hit Grenache with the rolled up newspaper a little bit and slow it down, I guess.
We see, obviously, Blewitt Springs is an area within the McLaren Vale that's really focused on in terms of high quality Grenache. Yep. It's sandy, right?
Yep. Yeah, very deep sands over clay. And I think what that means in a region like ours is that often we get sporadic rainfall, so a reasonable amount in one hit and then dry again, and what you need from a soil in those conditions is for it to accept moisture really quickly, and sand of course does that very well, but then of course you've then got clay underneath where you can store it, and I think that's a bit of the secret with why we can dry grow Grenache in Blewitt Springs so readily.
The other thing I would say that a lot of people have been talking to me about, and certainly just driving around with you this morning, it's really evident from the roadside, there's some really old vine material here, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in an Australian context, McLaren Vale has quite a long wine history. So if you think about the proclamation, official proclamation of the state of South Australia, 1836, John Rennell was already growing grapes in Ranella, just north of here, in 1838. So they worked out very quickly that it was a pretty nice place to grow grapes and make wine, and we're the beneficiaries of that. There's still some old vine material, and I guess at least some a couple hundred years almost of accumulated knowledge about which varieties work well in the right spots. So, yeah.
I tasted with Toby in Perth about 3 weeks ago now, and he mentioned that he'd purchased an old historical vineyard site in McLaren Vale,
Yes, yeah.
in Clarendon. And this morning we went and had a look at it, and it was far grander and far more exciting, thrilling really, than I had expected from what you had said. I mean, you talked about terraced vineyards and the history of the site, but it didn't go anywhere near to explaining the majesty of the view and the expanse of space that you have there. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing there?
Yeah, it's a good lesson on the diversity of McLaren Vale. That's part of its real beauty, I think, is this idea of the landscape being kind of an artist's palette. We can go to different parts of the valley to achieve different things. And Clarendon is the sort of the furthest inland and the highest part of the McLaren Vale region. So the landscape's quite different to the flats, very steep, and the site we're working with has a history back to the 1840s. It was described in the early days as a monument to pioneering viticulture in South Australia and was quite famous in its day, all pulled up during the Depression, 1930s. And we've been trying to resurrect that site for a couple of years now. So there's some vines on there that were planted in the early 90s, and that's 1990s, and that's what we're working with. But very steep. It had been abandoned for 10 years, and it's a massive resurrection job, but it's going to be such a unique, amazing part of the valley and give us something pretty special. We've got some neighbours across the river who are doing wonderful things. So the Hickenbotham site with Cabernet, and I think it's part of McLaren Vale where we might just test what we can do with that variety, which will be a whole new game for us.
Yeah.
But certainly Shiraz and Grenache and a little bit of Cab Franc there too will form part of that picture.
For me, in terms of first impressions and looking at the site, it's more than just a small terraced section, which is dramatic and steep at the top, but it actually wraps itself kind of around a gully and sort of around the angle down into the Onkaparinga River.
Yes. Yeah.
It's an incredibly beautiful site. I think you've got your work cut out for you in terms of like working the...
Yes, we've worked that out very quickly. Yeah.
But amazing potential.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to truly make handmade wines, then some of those difficulties that come with not being able to get machinery into sites and that sort of thing, they're less of an issue for us than someone who's making wine at the commercial end of the spectrum.
Because you're already accustomed to hand picking and hand working.
Yeah, so, and I guess Emma's European kind of history and the amount of time we've spent over there, we've seen a lot of hillside viticulture and, it's certainly all doable. You've just, and I think it's a nice way to create something unique, is do something that's a bit alternative to what's the norm. So.
While we're here, I'd like you to just talk to me about this 2020 Grenache.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about where the fruit's from and the philosophy behind Emmanuel's winemaking would be cool.
Yeah, so the first thing that we look at always in wine is texture. And I think the language around wine is often around flavour and aroma. But to me, the great wines of the world share the common thread amongst all of them is textural rather than flavour or aroma. So we want wines that are soft, silky, pleasurable to drink, but with this underlying structure. And we talked about silty tannin the other day. This, how do you describe something that you only have in your head to someone else? But to me, this concept of fine, silty, but still kind of gritty tannin profile in Grenache is what I want to see in the wines. And to me, from that respect, I've been saying to people, from that respect, the wine, Grenache, when it's done well from McLaren Vale, that structural element almost looks more Italian than French to me in some way. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone else, but that food friendliness with Grenache, I think, works really well for us.
Firstly, I don't care about food and wine. Food just gets in the way as far as I'm concerned. Secondly, the way I would describe the tannins, both through the lens of Bekkers and also a little more broadly in terms of the great Grenache producers in the region, is there's a real smithereen quality to the tannins. I mean, they're like very, very fine and just smashed into the fruit. They're everywhere. And what they become is defined by their structural integrity. They're tannic wines.
Yes.
But they're very, very fine tannins. And if you move down the Barbaresco sort of line in terms of like omnipresent tannins framed within very supple fruit, I think you're sort of starting to get the right picture about how these wines sit in the mouth.
Yeah, and I think people have a vision in their head that Grenache is Gamay.
Yeah.
Whole bunch Gamay, and it's not like that. So people think, okay, it's going to be bright, fragrant, bubblegummy. But to me, these wines typically don't look like that at all. Grenache is a very tannic variety. And I think that's why you usually see them from the better producers with slightly higher alcohols, because that tannin needs to be resolved, in my opinion, in the vineyard.
Yeah.
So if you pick Grenache too early, in my opinion, you haven't given the fruit the time to resolve that textural element in the vineyard. And once you've done that, you're stuck with it. So I think that's why you do see producers probably pushing the limits of ripening, trying to get that savoury element into these wines.
You guys are using a bit of whole bunch in these wines.
Yep.
So ripeness is important.
Yes, yeah.
If
so
you're
we
doing
would
that.
use, if you had to average it out, it'd be 20 or 25% across different percentages with different parcels and different years. So nothing's a recipe. It's always reactive to the year. But we do like that bit of aromatic punch, another layer of maybe texture from the stalks. Yeah. And Emmanuel's also really interested in kind of fermentation mechanics of having that sort of lattice built up in the ferment to allow, because we're very gentle in our pump over regime, to let the wine sort of trickle through. Creating these little channels by having those stalks in there is probably something we think is having an impact too. So, yeah.
I realise that I could probably sit here and talk to Toby all day about not just Grenache, but viticulture, dirt, vines. I'm like so into it, it's not funny. But that's about all we have time for, unfortunately. I'm looking forward to today. I've got a really exciting day full of discussions with producers about Grenache, effectively, including one where I'm going to get a bunch of them together.
Cool.
And we're going to talk about it together, and I can't wait. Yeah, I can't wait for that. So, thanks, Toby. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Cheers.
Thanks for your interest in it.